I never thought a single misstep could change everything. Not in a friendship that had lasted over a decade. Not in a bond that had survived every argument, every distance, every awkward phase. And yet, there it was, a misunderstanding so small, so quiet at first, that I barely noticed it, until it had grown into a wall between us. It started innocuously. A message I misread, a tone I assumed was judgmental, a joke taken the wrong way. I replayed it in my head, over and over, twisting it into meaning it never had. And instead of asking, instead of clarifying, I let it fester. By the time I finally spoke, it was too late. Words had been said, subtle digs, half apologies, passive remarks, everything meant to protect my ego but instead building tension. She noticed it immediately. I could see it in the way her smile faltered, how she hesitated when speaking to me, how a once effortless rhythm felt forced. I didn't realize what I had done at the time. I thought I was being cautious, careful. I thought I was avoiding conflict. But in truth, I had allowed pride and assumption to take control. And suddenly, a friendship that had been effortless, alive, and mutual felt fragile, strained, and distant. Weeks passed. Conversations became awkward. Texts went unanswered, or came back delayed, clipped, careful. Mutual friends noticed the shift, but every time someone tried to mediate, I brushed it off, silently confident that she would eventually come around. That she would see reason. That she would understand my intentions. She never did. Not immediately. And that's when I started to notice the cracks in myself. I replayed the misunderstanding in my mind constantly, dissecting every word, every expression, every choice I had made. I thought I could fix it quietly, subtly, without admitting the depth of my error. I began analyzing the friendship like a puzzle. What I had contributed, what she had done, what circumstances had allowed this to grow. And I began to see the truth. Friendship isn't just shared history or inside jokes. It isn't even loyalty. Not always. Sometimes it's clarity, communication, transparency. And the moment I let assumption take over, I had abandoned all three. Months passed. I felt the weight every day. That emptiness where laughter used to live. That silence where our conversations once flowed. That ache of losing someone I had once considered irreplaceable. And then, one day, the truth finally emerged. But I wasn't ready to hear it yet. The misunderstanding didn't happen overnight, but its effects were immediate. Every interaction after that moment, that single misread message, that offhand comment, became a minefield. I overanalyzed every word she said. I dissected every reaction. Even the way she laughed, the way she paused before replying, became evidence in my mind that she was upset, disappointed, or silently judging me. And because I assumed her intentions were negative, I started responding differently. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, I withdrew. I became careful with my words. I held back the small jokes, the teasing comments, the spontaneous thoughts that had once kept our friendship alive. I became cautious, rigid, almost robotic, a version of myself that I barely recognized. She, of course, noticed. Not immediately. People rarely notice small shifts in behavior at first. But over time, she began to react to my withdrawal. Subtle questions, an unusual tone in her voice, the occasional pause mid-conversation. She didn't accuse me. She didn't lash out. She adjusted. She navigated around the distance I had created. And the more she did, the more I assumed the worst. I kept thinking, she's judging me. She's angry. She's disappointed. She's moving on without me. And so I kept retreating. Every effort I made to fix things, to be careful, to be polite, to act like nothing had happened, only reinforced the gap between us. Then came the first real confrontation, the moment that could have repaired everything, but instead became another layer in the wall I had built. It happened at a mutual friends gathering. We had been sitting quietly, side by side, not speaking much, when someone made a comment that would have once sparked laughter between us. Instead, I hesitated. I didn't respond. I waited for her to jump in, to restore the rhythm we had always had. She did, but her words came differently this time. Measured. Slightly formal. A pause before the joke, a careful smile, an edge of uncertainty that had never existed before. The entire group noticed. I realized then that the friendship I had taken for granted, the effortless connection, the mutual understanding, had shifted irreversibly. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was fragile, delicate. At any moment, it could break completely, and I felt responsible. That night, alone, I replayed every interaction over the past months. Every text, every comment, every small misstep. The cumulative weight of it was staggering. I realized that the misunderstanding itself was minor, something that could have been cleared up in 5 minutes, but my pride, my assumptions, and my unwillingness to confront it had turned it into a chasm. I thought about reaching out. I considered calling her, texting her, sending a message that might explain my perspective, clarify my intentions, restore some semblance of the friendship we had lost. But fear stopped me. Fear that she had already judged me, fear that she wouldn't understand, fear that it was too late. Weeks stretched into months. And every day, the distance grew. Small interactions became rarer. Casual check-ins disappeared. And the emptiness of her absence began to settle into my daily life, quiet but persistent, like a shadow following me wherever I went. It was in those long months of reflection that I began to see the truth, not the truth of her intentions, but the truth of my own. I had let assumption and pride control me. I had let silence replace communication. I had allowed fear to determine my actions. And if I wanted this friendship back, I would have to confront more than just the misunderstanding. I would have to confront myself. The first attempt to reach out was anything but dramatic. I didn't send a long message, didn't call late at night, didn't stage a heartfelt moment. I simply texted her a single line. Can we talk? I stared at my phone for hours after sending it, replaying scenarios, imagining her anger, her disappointment, the way she might reject me outright. Every response I imagined was worse than the last. And yet, silence. For a whole day, she didn't reply. The next morning, I tried again. Slightly longer, slightly more vulnerable. I feel like things got misunderstood between us. I'd really like to clarify before we drift apart completely. Her reply came hours later. 2 words. Okay. Tomorrow. That okay carried a weight I hadn't expected. Relief, yes, but also tension. The kind of tension that makes your stomach twist and your hands tremble slightly. Because I knew that when we finally talked, nothing would be easy. We met at a small cafe, the kind of place we had visited countless times before. Familiar, comfortable, yet somehow unfamiliar now. The air between us thick with months of unspoken assumptions, quiet resentment, and lingering hurt. I started carefully. Not defensive. Not accusatory. Just explanation. Context. Perspective. I told her how I had misread that one message, how I had assumed things about her tone, her intentions, her feelings, assumptions that weren't hers to make, and shouldn't have been mine either. She listened. Quietly. Slowly. Not interrupting, but not smiling either. Eyes focused. Hands folded. I noticed her jaw tighten, the way she would shift in her seat when a memory she remembered differently surfaced in the conversation. Then she spoke. I thought, you didn't trust me, she said, almost in a whisper. I thought you didn't value me anymore. And I didn't know how to tell you without sounding angry. It was the first time I truly heard her perspective. The first time I realized that she, too, had been holding on to assumptions, misinterpretations, fear. For a moment, silence fell between us. A different silence than before. Not uncomfortable. Not tense. But thoughtful. Reflective. Both of us finally seeing how we had let months of miscommunication balloon into what felt like a wall. I admitted my pride. My fear. My stubbornness in not reaching out sooner. She admitted hers. The small lies we told ourselves to justify distance, the stories we created in our own heads to protect our egos. By the time we left the cafe, the air felt lighter. Not fully healed. Not perfect. But no longer suffocating. The first cracks in the barrier had appeared. And as I walked home that evening, I realized something profound. Misunderstandings are rarely fatal. They only become so when pride and fear are allowed to fester. And now that we had finally spoken, the real work, the restoration, could begin. Rebuilding trust didn't happen in a single conversation. That was the first thing I learned. Walking away from the cafe, I felt lighter, but I also felt exposed. Like we had opened a door that had been shut for months, only to realize the room behind it was fragile and unfinished. The days after our talk were careful ones. We texted again, but not the way we used to. Short messages. Neutral check-ins. No late-night rambling thoughts or spontaneous voice notes. It felt like learning how to speak a language we both used to know fluently, but had somehow forgotten. And I noticed something uncomfortable. I was hyper-aware of everything now. Every pause in her replies. Every emoji used or not used. I caught myself falling back into the same pattern. Assuming, interpreting, filling in gaps that didn't need filling. But this time, I stopped myself. Whenever doubt crept in, I forced myself to ask instead of assume. When something felt off, I named it gently. And when I felt misunderstood, I clarified, even when it felt awkward, even when it made my voice shake a little. She was doing the same. I could see it in the way she'd hesitate before reacting, choosing her words more carefully. In the way she'd check in with me after conversations that felt heavier than usual. In the way she'd admit, openly, when something reminded her of the months we lost. Not everything went smoothly. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced without warning. A casual joke that landed wrong. A memory referenced that still carried emotional residue. Sometimes, one of us would retreat instinctively, pulling back just enough to test whether the other would notice. And when those moments happened, I felt fear spike again. What if this is where it breaks for good? But instead of letting silence take over like before, one of us always spoke. Sometimes it was clumsy. Sometimes it was too honest. But it was spoken. And every time we did that, something shifted. Slowly, the laughter came back. Not all at once. More like brief appearances. A familiar tone in her voice. A shared glance that said, "You remember this too." One evening, she sent me a message that caught me off guard. I missed us. I just didn't know how to say it without sounding weak. I stared at my phone for a long time before replying. Because the truth was, I had felt the same way. But admitting it meant admitting how much I had lost by staying silent for so long. So I told her. And in that moment, something settled between us. Not perfection, not full closure, but understanding. I realized then that the hardest part of repairing a friendship isn't apologizing. It's staying present afterward. Showing up again and again, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when trust still feels fragile. Because healing isn't loud. It's quiet. It's deliberate. And it requires courage long after the apology has been accepted. Just when I thought we were steady again, something threatened to undo all the progress we had made. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No confrontation. Just a quiet moment that felt familiar in the worst way, the kind that had started all of this in the first place. I heard from someone else that she had been going through something difficult. Something personal. And she hadn't told me. At first, I tried to ignore the feeling that rose in my chest. I told myself not everything was about me. That rebuilding trust didn't mean instant closeness. That she was allowed her privacy. But the old voice crept back in. Why wouldn't she tell me? Does she still not trust me? Am I still on the outside? For days, I wrestled with whether to bring it up. I didn't want to sound accusatory. I didn't want to reopen wounds. But the longer I stayed quiet, the heavier it became. I could feel the same familiar tension settling in, that tightness in my chest, that distance creeping into my replies. She noticed. Of course she did. One evening, she asked me directly, "You've been different again. Did I do something?" The question caught me off guard. It was gentle, honest, vulnerable. And yet, my first instinct was still to protect myself, to minimize, to say everything was fine. But I didn't. I told her the truth. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but honestly. I told her how hearing about her struggle from someone else made me feel sidelined, how it brought back the fear that maybe I was still being kept at arm's length. She went quiet. Not defensive. Not angry. Just quiet. And that silence terrified me more than any argument could have. Then she said something that reframed everything. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if I leaned on you too soon, we'd fall back into patterns. Afraid of needing you and then losing you again." I hadn't considered that. In my mind, withholding had always meant distance. But for her, it had meant caution. Self-protection. The same fear that had driven my own silence months earlier. That night, we talked longer than we had in over a year. About the pressure of expectations. About how we both hated conflict but avoided it in different ways. About how misunderstandings don't always come from malice. Sometimes they come from two people trying, in their own flawed ways, not to get hurt. And finally, the full truth emerged. The original misunderstanding, the one that started everything, had never meant what I thought it did. Not even close. The tone I had read into that message, a projection of my own insecurity. The meaning I assumed, never intended. I felt foolish. Relieved. Heavy. Light. All at once. But instead of dwelling on regret, something else happened, something unexpected. We laughed. Not nervously. Not politely. But genuinely. At how human we had been. How fragile. How stubborn. And in that laughter, I felt it. The friendship returning, not as it was before, but stronger. More intentional. More honest. Still, I knew one thing. This was the turning point. What came next would determine whether this friendship truly healed, or whether this was simply a calm before another quiet ending. After that night, something changed, but not in the way I expected. There was no dramatic declaration that everything was fixed. No sudden return to how things used to be. Instead, there was a quiet understanding between us, almost fragile in its honesty. Like we both knew that what we had now was valuable precisely because it had nearly been lost. We started showing up differently. I noticed it in small moments. She'd tell me things earlier instead of after the fact. I'd listen without immediately trying to interpret what wasn't being said. When doubt crept in, because it still did, I named it instead of letting it grow in silence. And sometimes, it was uncomfortable. There were moments when we caught ourselves hesitating, measuring words, wondering whether honesty would hurt more than silence. But this time, we chose honesty anyway. Even when our voices wavered. Even when we weren't sure how the other would respond. One evening, she said something that stayed with me. "I think we both spent so long protecting ourselves that we forgot how to trust each other." She wasn't accusing me. She wasn't blaming herself. She was naming the truth. Calmly, without bitterness. And hearing it said out loud felt like a release. Trust, I realized, isn't something that magically returns once a misunderstanding is cleared. It's a decision you make again and again. A willingness to believe someone's intentions before assuming their flaws. Still, there was one lingering fear I hadn't voiced. What if this had changed us too much? What if we could never go back to that effortless closeness? I brought it up one night. My voice quieter than I intended. I told her I was afraid that even though we were healing, we might never be the same. She didn't rush to reassure me. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe we're not supposed to be the same. Maybe we're supposed to be better." That was when it clicked. The friendship we were rebuilding wasn't about recreating the past. It was about building something more intentional, something grounded in communication instead of assumption, presence instead of pride. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I stopped bracing for loss. Stopped scanning for signs of distance. Stopped letting fear narrate the story. Instead, I allowed myself to be present, fully, imperfectly, honestly. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't confronting someone else. It's choosing to stay open after being hurt. And I could feel it now. The friendship wasn't just surviving. It was settling into something solid. Something earned. There was only one thing left. A moment that would quietly confirm whether this trust would last beyond reflection and conversation. A moment neither of us could plan for, but both of us would recognize when it arrived. The moment came without ceremony. No warning. No build-up. Just an ordinary day that turned into something quietly defining. She called me late in the evening. Not to vent. Not to explain. Just to talk. About nothing important at first. Work frustrations, a story she'd read, a memory we both laughed at. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized something had shifted completely. There was no tension in her voice. No hesitation. No distance to navigate. She was simply there. And so was I. It struck me then that the friendship didn't need a grand moment to prove it had survived. The proof was in the ease. The absence of fear. The comfort of not overthinking every word. Later, she said something simple that stayed with me. I'm glad we didn't give up on this. So was I. Because what we nearly lost wasn't just a friendship. It was a lesson. One I carry with me now, quietly, deliberately. I learned how easily assumptions can masquerade as truth. How silence, when used as protection, can become a weapon. How pride often disguises itself as self-respect. But I also learned something gentler. That people are flawed, but rarely malicious. That misunderstanding doesn't mean betrayal. And that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is choose conversation over certainty. We didn't go back to who we were before. We became something steadier, more honest, less fragile. And now, when I think about that time, the distance, the silence, the almost ending, I don't feel regret anymore. I feel gratitude. Because it forced me to confront how I show up in relationships. It taught me to listen before assuming, to ask before withdrawing. Some friendships end loudly. Others almost disappear quietly. Ours survived because we noticed the silence, and chose to break it. And that choice changed everything.